This is the worst day in the history of our church. My friends, I could not believe my ears as the most beloved patriarch at my previous congregation screamed at me from across the table during our monthly leadership meeting. Why was he yelling at me? He was yelling because he fully believed that I, an ordained minister, had been duped, tricked by Satan himself. Why did he believe this? It's a good question. Because I had the audacity to advocate for the full inclusion of women into all aspects of the church's leadership. Lord have mercy, a Christian feminist. Somebody please call an exorcist, right? You see, before I became an Episcopal priest, I was an associate pastor in a very different tradition for about 7 years, in a little church that had never allowed women to serve in any leadership role whatsoever. A woman could not even preach a sermon in that church. It had never been done before. But about halfway through my time there, a lady came forward and told the all-male board of elders, or the all-male leadership team, that she too had been an elder in her previous context, and that she had preached quite frequently in that church. And all she wanted was the opportunity to be able to serve our church in this way because she loved our church, and she wanted to use her gifts to strengthen our community. But whenever the elders told her that they would think about it, I knew what this meant. I knew it was code for, yeah, we're not really going to think about it. And once I noticed that her request wasn't even included in the agenda for the next month's elders meeting, I decided to press the issue just a tad. So I came up with the most robust biblical and theological argument I could muster up. And I argued at that next meeting for the full inclusion of women into every facet of leadership in the church. It was this action of mine that drew out the elder's wrath. He never even engaged my argument, y'all. He just lashed out in rage, loudly lamenting that the spirit of liberalism or the spirit of Satan, to him they were one and the same thing, had taken over his precious church because of my actions that day. You think about that. The day that someone boldly advocated for the equality of women in his church was the worst day in the history of his church, according to him. The thing that was so damn discouraging to me in that moment, other than the blatant misogyny, and other than being barked at by the most revered person in the whole church, was that while I believed that I was doing the work of God's kingdom come and advocating for the equality of women, this elder actually believed that I was doing the work of the devil. While I knew that I was advocating for the greater good, he saw me as advocating for something that was horrendously evil. Well, the heartache and the confusion that I experienced that day doesn't even come close, not even close, to comparing to the heartache and the confusion that millions upon millions of women have suffered because of Christian men just like that. I will say that that moment was still very painful and disorienting for me, because it was the day that I became acutely aware that there were two different kinds of Christianity at work in that room. Two completely different takes on what Jesus' message of love is all about. That day was the day when I finally came to grips with the fact that the God that many Christians believe in is not the God that I believe in. And perhaps the most disheartening thing about this whole story is that it's not a rare story. It's actually a pretty typical story, isn't it? Most people who leave the church behind and never look back do so because they encounter very similar situations. They've been barked at in similar ways. And they cannot square their experience of God with the closed-minded messages being hurled at them by the leaders of the church. To be honest with you, the only reason I didn't leave the Christian religion behind that day is because I don't believe that people like that, elders like that, men like that, Christians like that, have the final word on God's kingdom. And one of my saving graces was that as the elder was on his power trip, screaming at me from the other side of the table, one of my favorite quotes came through my mind. The church is a lot like a swimming pool. All of the noise comes from the shallow end. So instead of deciding to get out of the pool altogether, I knew that I could simply put my shades on, put my earbuds in, mix up a pina colada, blow up a floaty, and let myself rest on the quieter, calmer waters of the much neglected deep end of the pool, if you catch my drift. But I also didn't leave the Christian religion behind that day, because I have also known this one thing, to be very true all along. That the heresy of today will be the orthodoxy of tomorrow. Jesus, the apostles, and every person who has ever been worthy of the title saint, they were all seen as heretics at one point in time. I mean, Jesus was crucified as a heretic. So whenever we aren't being accused of heresy, and whenever other Christians never condemn our Christianity, it probably means we aren't following Jesus all that closely. In our gospel reading for today, a massive crowd of people, those who were broken, those who were marginalized, those who were seen as ritually unclean, those who were labeled as heretics, a large crowd has gathered around Jesus. I mean, people came from all over just to hear him teach, just to be in his presence. And the space became so crowded that apparently Jesus and his disciples couldn't even eat a meal. There was no elbow room left for them at the table. It was just far too crowded. But then the story takes kind of an odd turn in a couple of different ways. We are told that Jesus' family came to restrain him because a rumor was going around that he was starting to lose his mind. Something about the whole crowded scene led some people to conclude that Jesus was not in a good place mentally. But not only that, some religious fundamentalists also accused him of being possessed by Beelzebub or by Satan whenever they saw the type of people that Jesus was associating himself with. And we're never explicitly told in the text itself why some people began to feel like Jesus might be losing his mind, or why others thought he might be demon-possessed, but the answer is clear and obvious. No one in their right mind would unconditionally welcome so many different outcasts and heretics to the table. No one who is truly pure, holy, and undefiled by the devil would be so open-minded towards and so accepting of such a wretched and despicable and sinful crowd of people. And some fundamentalistic religious teachers saw Jesus' spirit of love that day, his spirit of love and acceptance, and they decided to call that spirit demonic. In response to this accusation, Jesus says something that's actually quite jarring. Truly, I tell you, people will be forgiven for their sins and whatever blasphemies they utter, but whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit can never have forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin. Now we can decipher the meaning of Jesus' kind of troubling words here by first asking again, who was he directing these words towards? Was Jesus directing his words towards all the people crowded in that room, the so-called sinners and outcasts and heretics? Or was he directing them against the religious establishment specifically? If we look closely at the text, we see that it was the religious teachers who accused Jesus of being demon-possessed. And he was countering this accusation. Once we see this, the meaning of Jesus' teaching becomes crystal clear. And many of us are too nice to actually name the takeaway, the meaning. I'm not so nice. I'll name it. What is the unforgivable sin? Fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is the unforgivable sin. Whenever religious people see the Spirit of God clearly at work in the so-called unclean and sinful people around them, and when these religious people go on to label this spirit as being demonic in nature, it only goes to show that these religious people have done something to themselves that even the grace of God will have a hard time undoing. Whenever clergy and church leaders not only refuse to be as loving and as inclusive as Jesus is, but decide to label the love and inclusivity that they see outside of the church as being demonic in origin, it is they who are blind to the work of the Spirit. When people, in the name of their religion, warp themselves to the degree where they come to see genuine love as an expression of evil, it is proof of their hard-heartedness towards God, because God is love. To confuse love with evil is to confuse God with the devil. And this sin is so serious, not because God will withhold forgiveness from those who commit it, but because those who commit it are actually the ones who are withholding forgiveness from themselves. It's their own narrow view of God that is actually getting in the way of the relationship that they could have with God. And the sin is so serious because it not only confuses love for evil and God for the devil, but because the flip side is also just as true. It confuses evil for love and the devil for God. While those who commit the sin feel as though they are being loving, everyone else around them perceives their love as hate. While those who commit the sin feel as though they are sharing the good news of God's grace with everyone, everyone on the receiving end of that good news feels smothered and oppressed by it. My friends, we don't want to cause any unnecessary offense to anyone. However, we do take heart in knowing that, as Jesus says, students are not above their masters. What happened to Jesus will happen to those who are sincerely trying to follow him. So whenever we Episcopalians weird out our fundamentalistic Christian neighbors and even provoke their judgment and their anger, all because we choose to love and affirm those they refuse to love and affirm, we take heart. Out of all of the things we get wrong, and we get many things wrong, we know that we are at least doing something right. Why? Because we know that we are never more like Jesus than when we are being persecuted by the members of our own religion for being too loving and too inclusive.